The forest didn't call his name in words, but something inside Staff Sergeant Jason Miller knew it was calling him anyway. It was 2:17 a.m. at the edge of Fort Ridge Training Reserve, Georgia, and the air had that uneasy stillness that only comes before something breaks. No wind, no insects, just silence pressed so tight it felt like it had weight. Jason sat up on the narrow bunk inside the temporary security barracks, one hand already on the edge of the cot, before he fully understood why he had woken. Shadow was gone. That was the first thought that cut through him like a wire snapping in the dark. 6 years old, German Shepherd K9, tactical trained, disciplined beyond hesitation, Shadow never broke protocol. Never. Jason was on his feet within seconds, boots hitting the cold concrete floor, heart already sinking with a feeling he couldn't explain. Outside, the floodlights washed the compound in pale white, but something was wrong in the pattern of shadows near the perimeter fence. Then he saw it. A gap in motion, a break in rhythm, and beyond it, just past the warning lights, a shape moving fast toward the tree line. Shadow. No bark. No hesitation. Just movement. Focused, urgent, unnatural in its intensity. Jason stepped forward instinctively. Shadow. His voice cut through the night, low but firm, the kind of command meant to stop trained instinct. But the dog didn't stop. If anything, he moved faster, vanishing into the edge of the forest where the light died and the world turned into layers of black and deeper black. Jason felt something tighten in his chest, not fear exactly, but recognition. Shadow wasn't running away. He was running toward something, and that was worse. Within minutes, Jason was geared up, vest half-fastened, flashlight clipped, radio crackling with static as he crossed the fence line. Control, this is Miller. K9 unit has breached perimeter heading north into restricted woodland sector. Requesting silent pursuit. The response came delayed, broken by interference. Copy, Sergeant. Proceed with caution. No known activity in that zone. No known activity. Jason almost laughed at that. That was never a comforting phrase. The forest swallowed him immediately. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees, the air shifting from warm southern humidity to something colder, denser, like breathing through damp cloth. The beam of his flashlight cut narrow tunnels through the trees, revealing roots like twisted hands and fog moving low across the ground, as if the earth itself was exhaling. Shadow, he called again, quieter this time, more controlled. No answer. But there was a sound now. Not loud, not obvious, just enough to change direction. A soft disturbance ahead, branches shifting without wind, the faint crunch of pine needles under weight that wasn't his. Jason slowed. His training took over. Every step measured. Every breath controlled. But underneath it all, something personal was building. A thread of unease tied directly to the dog he trusted more than most humans. Shadow had saved his life once in Kandahar. Pulled him out of a collapsed structure when radio contact was gone and time had run out. Jason still remembered the weight of that moment more than the explosion itself. Since then, trust wasn't a choice. It was fact. That's why this felt wrong. The deeper he moved into the forest, the more the silence began to feel intentional, as if the world was holding its breath with him. Then he saw it. A strip of torn fabric caught on a low branch, swaying slightly. Military issue. Not his unit. Jason crouched slowly, flashlight steady. The fabric was fresh enough to still carry the smell of oil and rain. His jaw tightened. Shadow. He whispered, but this time it wasn't a call. It was acknowledgement. Something had already happened here. Something recent. A few yards ahead, Shadow finally appeared. Standing still. Completely still. Watching something deeper in the dark where even the flashlight couldn't fully reach. His posture wasn't aggressive. It wasn't fearful either. It was focused in a way Jason had only seen once before, back when Shadow had detected an explosive device hidden beneath a supply convoy. That same stillness. That same absolute certainty. Jason moved closer, slower now. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly, though he already knew the answer would not come in words. Shadow didn't look back. He just stared into the dark forest as if the darkness itself had taken shape. And then, for the first time since Jason had known him, Shadow stepped forward without waiting for command. And Jason followed. Not because he understood, but because Shadow had never been wrong about what came next. The moment Shadow moved deeper into the forest without waiting for a command, Jason Miller felt the shift in the air, as if the world itself had agreed to follow. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight, its beam cutting through dense layers of pine and drifting fog that clung low to the ground like something alive. Every step forward felt less like pursuit and more like surrender to something he could not yet name. The forest here was older than the training grounds, untouched in a way that made sound feel out of place. Even the crunch of his boots seemed swallowed instantly, as if the earth refused to repeat it. Shadow stayed just far enough ahead to be seen in brief flashes between trunks, his silhouette appearing and disappearing like a thought half remembered. Jason's radio crackled again, but this time the static was longer, heavier, almost like a voice trying and failing to form words. He tapped it once. No response. Only silence returned, and in that silence, his memory pulled him backward without permission. Kandahar had smelled different, but the feeling was the same. Dust instead of pine, heat instead of cold, but that same invisible pressure in the air before something revealed itself. He remembered Shadow then too, moving through debris after an explosion had cut off their unit from extraction. No panic, no hesitation, only that same calm certainty guiding Jason through smoke and broken structures until they found each other again. Shadow had not barked that day either. He had simply waited until Jason understood where to go. The memory tightened in Jason's chest as he pushed forward into the present forest. A low branch brushed his shoulder, pulling him back to reality. Ahead, Shadow stopped suddenly. The stillness was immediate and absolute, like a switch flipped inside him. Jason slowed his pace instinctively, raising the flashlight slightly. The beam landed on something unusual hanging from a broken twig. A strip of military fabric, torn clean but not weathered, as if it had been caught there only hours ago. Jason crouched, studying it. The fabric carried a faint scent of fuel and damp earth, not enough to place easily, but enough to confirm recent human presence. He stood slowly, eyes narrowing as he scanned the surrounding ground. Footprints appeared faintly in the soft soil, partially blurred by moisture, but still visible enough to show direction. They did not follow any standard patrol pattern. They were uneven, rushed, as if the person had moved quickly without full awareness of their surroundings. Shadow shifted slightly, his ears angled forward, not toward the footprints, but deeper into the forest where the light could not reach. Jason felt it then, that subtle internal pressure again, the same sensation that had pulled him awake earlier in the barracks. It was not fear. It was recognition without explanation. He continued forward, each step slower now, more deliberate. The forest seemed to narrow around him, trunks growing closer together as if guiding him down a corridor carved by intention rather than chance. The flashlight beam began to flicker faintly, not from failure, but from interference he could not explain. He checked the battery instinctively. Full charge. Still the light pulsed irregularly, like something was disrupting its steadiness. Shadow moved again, pausing only briefly before continuing. Jason whispered his name under his breath, not as a command, but as reassurance, though he was not sure to whom. The deeper they went, the more the forest changed character. The wind, once absent, now moved in faint waves through the branches, carrying sounds that were too soft to identify. At one point, Jason thought he heard metal shifting, distant and subtle, but when he stopped to listen, the sound dissolved into silence. He raised his radio again. "Control, do you read me?" Only static answered, but within that static there was a pattern now, almost rhythmic, like something trying to communicate through interference. Jason lowered it slowly, unease settling deeper, but controlled by discipline. Shadow finally stopped at a small clearing where the trees opened slightly, revealing a patch of ground disturbed more heavily than anything they had seen so far. Jason stepped beside him, scanning carefully. There were multiple sets of footprints here, overlapping, some fresh, some fading, all converging toward a single direction deeper into the forest. And among them, something else caught his attention. A small personal item partially buried in leaves. He knelt and picked it up carefully. It was a military identification tag, scratched but intact. He did not recognize the name immediately, but the significance was unmistakable. Someone was still out here. Someone who had not simply passed through, but had been waiting or hidden or left behind. Shadow let out a low breath through his nose, not a growl, not a whine, but something closer to acknowledgement. Jason looked at him, then back into the darkness beyond the clearing. The feeling that had been building since the barracks now solidified into certainty. Shadow had not run without reason. He had been following something real all along. Jason tightened his grip on the tag and stepped forward again, this time not as someone searching blindly, but as someone beginning to understand that the forest was not hiding a mystery from them. It was revealing one piece at a time, and Shadow had already seen what came next long before he had the deeper Jason Miller and Shadow moved into the forest. The more the world around them began to feel less like terrain and more like a memory trying to surface. The trees stood closer now, their trunks rising like silent sentinels, and the faint mist drifting between them caught the flashlight beam in uneven fragments that made distance hard to trust. Jason kept his breathing steady, trained discipline overriding the rising tension in his chest. But something about the stillness ahead felt different from anything he had encountered on patrol or training exercises. Shadow continued to lead, but now his pace had changed. Slower, more deliberate. Every few steps he would pause, ears rotating, as if listening for signals that existed outside human perception. Jason followed the rhythm, trusting it even when he could not explain it. The identification tag he had found earlier was still in his hand, cold against his glove, its presence a reminder that this was no longer just a routine search. It belonged to someone who had been here recently. The forest floor began to shift underfoot from soft pine needles to uneven patches of exposed root and damp stone, and with each step forward the air seemed to grow heavier, not in pressure, but in meaning. Then Shadow stopped completely. Jason halted behind him immediately, scanning the area. The flashlight beam moved across a narrow depression in the ground where the earth had been disturbed more than anywhere else they had seen so far. It was not chaotic, but intentional, as if something had been moved or uncovered and then carefully left behind. Jason crouched, eyes narrowing as he noticed faint impressions in the soil forming a path that curved slightly toward a dense cluster of trees ahead. Shadow did not bark or growl. Instead, he remained perfectly still, his gaze locked forward with an intensity that Jason had only seen during moments of extreme certainty in the field. Jason felt his pulse slow instinctively, not from calm, but from focus. He adjusted the flashlight angle and stepped closer to the tree line. The light caught something partially hidden between two large roots. A small survival pouch, military issue, weathered but intact. He reached for it carefully and opened it. Inside were basic supplies, compressed ration packaging, a worn map fragment, and a folded piece of paper sealed inside plastic. Jason unfolded it slowly, the beam of the flashlight illuminating handwritten notes that were rushed but deliberate. Coordinates. Not random. Structured. His mind immediately began calculating distance and direction. Whatever this was, it had been planned or recorded under pressure, not abandoned carelessly. Shadow shifted slightly beside him, a subtle movement that drew Jason's attention back to the environment rather than the object in his hands. The dog's focus was not on the pouch. It was beyond it. Jason turned his head slowly and followed Shadow's line of sight. Through the dense arrangement of trees, there was a faint change in darkness, not natural shadow, but something layered differently, as if space itself had depth where it should not. Jason stood slowly, pocketing the contents of the pouch with controlled precision. The coordinates in his mind aligned with the direction Shadow was already facing. Without speaking, he began to move again. This time, Shadow did not lead far ahead. He stayed closer, almost beside Jason, as if the path ahead required unity rather than guidance. The forest grew quieter with every step, not in absence of sound, but in absence of randomness. Even the wind seemed to reduce itself to controlled intervals. Jason's training told him to report, to pause, to reassess, but instinct told him something else entirely. They were approaching the center of whatever pattern the forest had been hiding. After several minutes of steady movement, the trees finally began to open into a wider clearing. Jason slowed immediately, raising the flashlight carefully before stepping forward. What he saw was not chaos or destruction, but structure. A makeshift shelter had been constructed using canvas, branches, and repurposed military fabric. It was not abandoned. It was maintained, recently used, and deliberately concealed. Shadow moved forward first, stopping just short of the perimeter. Jason followed more cautiously now, eyes scanning every angle. The air here was different. It carried faint traces of fuel, paper, and damp cloth, layered together in a way that confirmed recent human presence. Jason stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating a partially open flap of the shelter. Inside, supplies were arranged with precision rather than disorder. A radio unit sat on a small crate, its antenna bent but intact. Nearby, a journal lay open, its pages filled with notes that referenced movement schedules, weather patterns, and coded references to locations Jason did not immediately recognize. Shadow let out a low, controlled breath, then turned his head sharply toward a section of the clearing beyond the shelter. Jason followed instantly, his attention shifting with the dog's reaction. There, partially obscured by brush, was a narrow path leading further downhill, marked subtly by disturbed vegetation. Jason felt the weight of realization building in his chest. This was not a random campsite. It was a waypoint, and whatever Shadow had been leading him toward was still not fully revealed. The forest, once silent and uncertain, now felt like it was guiding them forward step by step, as if the truth itself had been waiting patiently to be reached rather than discovered. Shadow moved again, one step at a time, and Jason followed without hesitation, understanding now that every choice had already been shaped long before they arrived. The narrow path leading away from the hidden shelter grew steeper with every step, as if the forest itself was beginning to tilt downward into something deeper and less familiar. Jason Miller kept his flashlight angled low now, not wanting to announce their presence to anything that might be ahead, though every instinct he had told him that whatever was here already knew they were coming. Shadow moved with quiet precision beside him, no longer pulling forward with urgency, but maintaining a steady pace that felt almost synchronized with Jason's breathing. The silence between them was no longer empty. It felt intentional, like a shared understanding forming without words. As they descended, the temperature dropped noticeably, the air shifting from damp forest humidity to something colder and stiller, like the inside of a structure rather than open land. Jason noticed it first in his breath, faint traces of condensation appearing with each exhale. The trees here were older, thicker, their branches twisting overhead in ways that blocked most of the remaining sky. The flashlight beam began to reflect differently off surfaces ahead, catching faint metallic glints that did not belong to natural terrain. Shadow stopped again. This time, Jason stopped instantly beside him without needing a signal. The dog's posture had changed slightly, not tense, not relaxed, but attentive in a way that suggested confirmation rather than discovery. Jason followed Shadow's gaze and slowly angled the flashlight forward. At first, all he saw was uneven ground and scattered foliage, but then the beam caught a straight edge where nature did not normally create lines. A structure, partially buried, concealed beneath layers of camouflage netting, branches, and debris arranged deliberately to blend into the environment. Jason crouched slightly, moving forward with controlled caution. The closer he got, the clearer it became that this was not an abandoned site. It was maintained. Subtle signs of recent activity were everywhere once he knew how to look. Fresh footprints crossing and recrossing the same narrow entry point. Fabric ties that had not yet decayed. A faint smell of fuel and paper that lingered in the cold air. Shadow remained at his side, his attention fixed on the same point. But now there was something different in his stance. It was not alertness born of threat, but recognition, as if he understood what this place represented long before Jason did. Jason reached the edge of the concealed structure and carefully lifted part of the camouflaging material. Beneath it was a reinforced frame, not large, but engineered with precision. It resembled a field operations outpost, though not one that appeared on any standard map or approved operational briefing. Inside, the space was dimly lit by a small battery-powered lantern resting on a crate. The light revealed organized equipment, communication devices, sealed containers, and field notes arranged with deliberate structure. Jason stepped inside slowly, scanning every detail. Nothing suggested panic or abandonment. Everything suggested continuity. Someone had been here recently and intended to return. He moved closer to the center where a table had been assembled from repurposed materials. On it lay several maps layered over each other, marked with coordinates and symbols that did not match standard military notation. Shadow entered behind him but stayed near the entrance, watching outward as if maintaining awareness of both inside and outside simultaneously. Jason studied the maps carefully, tracing routes with his eyes. The pattern was becoming clearer now, not random movement, but structured communication through location. Whoever had built this system was not hiding in fear. They were operating with purpose. A faint sound from outside the structure made Jason pause instantly. Not footsteps, not movement through brush. Something more subtle. A rhythmic disturbance in the air, like distant equipment or controlled motion moving through the forest beyond their position. Jason turned slightly toward Shadow, but the dog was already focused in that direction. There was no hesitation in him now, only certainty. Jason reached for his radio again, but stopped before activating it. Something told him not to break the silence yet. Instead, he moved closer to the edge of the structure and carefully looked out through a narrow opening in the camouflage. Beyond the trees, the terrain opened slightly into another clearing, larger than the last. And there, partially visible through the fog, were faint outlines of additional structures, arranged in a pattern that suggested coordination rather than isolation. Jason's mind worked quickly, connecting fragments of information from the tag, the pouch, the coordinates, and the shelter. This was not a single point of interest. It was a network. Shadow moved to stand beside him, his presence steady and unwavering. Jason looked down at him briefly, then back toward the distant clearing. The realization formed fully now, not as a theory, but as certainty. They had not been following a random trail. They had been following a deliberate path already laid out, one that Shadow had recognized long before Jason had the information to understand it. And whatever lay ahead was not simply hidden in the forest. It was waiting to be seen. Jason Miller stayed still at the edge of the concealed structure, his eyes locked on the distant clearing where faint outlines of additional formations broke through the fog, like pieces of a puzzle refusing to fully reveal themselves at once. The forest was no longer just a natural environment around them. It had become a layered space of intention, where every opening between trees seemed to frame something placed there deliberately. Shadow stood beside him without movement, his attention fixed forward with an intensity that felt almost measured, as if he were waiting for Jason to reach the same. Understanding he had already accepted, Jason lowered his breathing again, controlling the rise of tension in his chest as he studied the terrain ahead. The second clearing was larger than anything they had encountered so far, and the arrangement of shapes within it suggested structure rather than randomness. Tents, or shelters, partially hidden under camouflage netting, were spaced at calculated intervals, forming a pattern that implied coordination and discipline. Jason shifted slightly, adjusting his position to get a clearer view through the gap in the foliage. The flashlight remained off now, his eyes relying on natural contrast between fog and faint ambient light filtering through the canopy. Shadow moved one step closer to him, not ahead, not behind, but aligned. That subtle change in positioning caught Jason's attention more than anything else. It was not guidance anymore. It was confirmation. Whatever lay ahead, Shadow was not discovering it in real time. He was recognizing it. Jason felt a quiet pressure build in his thoughts as he processed the implication. The survival pouch, the identification tag, the coded coordinates, the concealed shelters. Each piece alone could be explained away. Together, they formed something far more deliberate. A network operating outside standard oversight. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cold air. The radio in his vest remained silent, no longer even producing static. It was as if the forest itself had absorbed communication entirely. Jason reached into his pocket and touched the identification tag again, grounding himself in something physical. Then he looked at Shadow. The dog's gaze remained fixed forward, unblinking, focused not on threat, but on certainty. Jason followed that gaze once more toward the clearing. For the first time since they entered the forest, he saw movement that was not wind or shadow. A faint shift near one of the distant structures. Not abrupt, not chaotic, but controlled. Someone was there. Still present. Still operating. Jason tightened his grip on the edge of the structure's opening and leaned slightly forward to refine his angle. The fog drifted slowly across the clearing, revealing and concealing shapes and intervals, as if the environment itself was reluctant to fully expose what lay within. He could now distinguish pathways between the shelters, narrow but defined, indicating repeated use rather than initial construction. Foot traffic patterns were visible even from this distance, worn into the ground in a way that suggested sustained presence. Shadow's ears shifted slightly, reacting before Jason did. That subtle motion was enough to confirm that whatever he had sensed earlier was not imagination or instinct alone. It was real, external, and ongoing. Jason stepped back into the shelter for a moment, eyes scanning the interior again. The maps on the table now felt different under this new context. What had once seemed like scattered coordinates now resembled a grid of movement and control points. He traced one line with his finger, noticing how it aligned with the direction of the clearing outside. Everything converged there. Shadow remained near the entrance, still watching outward. Jason returned to his side, lowering himself slightly to match the dog's level. For a brief moment, he studied Shadow's expression, trying to understand how much of this the dog truly perceived beyond instinct. There was no aggression in Shadow's posture, no uncertainty, only recognition and focus, as if he were reconnecting with something already known but temporarily hidden. Jason made a decision without speaking. He adjusted his gear quietly, ensuring nothing would create unnecessary noise, and stepped back toward the edge of the structure. Shadow moved with him instantly. Together, they returned to the narrow opening overlooking the clearing. The fog had shifted slightly, revealing more detail now. Jason could see faint lights deeper within the arrangement, not bright enough to signal openly, but enough to confirm activity. His mind cataloged every detail rapidly, shifting from uncertainty to structured awareness. This was not a chance discovery. It was a system, and systems implied purpose, hierarchy, and intent. Shadow took one small step forward, then stopped, waiting. Jason understood that moment without needing interpretation. This was the threshold. Beyond this point, nothing would remain unclear for much longer. He placed one hand briefly on Shadow's back, grounding himself in the steady presence beside him, then looked forward again into the clearing where the unknown waited not in chaos, but in quiet organization. And as they stood there together, the forest no longer felt like something they were moving through, but something that had been guiding them all along toward this exact moment of arrival. Jason Miller and Shadow remained at the edge of the clearing, motionless for several seconds, as if the forest itself was waiting to confirm whether they truly belonged there. The fog shifted in slow waves across the open space, revealing more of the hidden structures with each passing moment. What had once looked like distant shapes now resolved into organized field stations, arranged with deliberate spacing and connected by narrow paths that cut through the undergrowth like veins. Jason's eyes moved carefully from left to right, mapping everything without speaking, his training taking over where certainty ended. Shadow stood beside him, still and focused, his attention fixed on the center of the clearing rather than the edges, as if something there carried greater importance than anything else around it. Jason noticed subtle movement near one of the central shelters. Not rushed, not defensive, but controlled and methodical. A figure stepped partially into view, then paused, as if listening. Jason immediately lowered his profile behind a cluster of trees, signaling Shadow with a small hand gesture to remain steady. The dog obeyed without hesitation, his presence calm but alert. From this distance, Jason could now see more detail. The central structure was larger than the others, reinforced and partially covered with layered camouflage material that had been adjusted recently. Soft lights spilled from within, not bright enough to expose the entire interior, but enough to indicate active use. Jason adjusted his position slightly, careful not to disturb the fallen branches beneath him. His mind worked through possibilities rapidly, each one more complex than the last. This was not a temporary campsite or abandoned field station. It was an active network operating deep within restricted forest terrain, far from any authorized exercise zone. Shadow shifted his weight slightly and took one slow step forward, then stopped again. Jason followed that subtle cue, moving just enough to maintain visual contact with the clearing. That was when he saw it. Another figure appeared near the central structure, this one moving with measured urgency. The person carried a small equipment case, placing it carefully on a raised platform before opening it. The contents were not immediately visible, but the motion suggested maintenance or coordination rather than haste. Jason felt a tightening in his chest, not from fear, but from recognition of structure within the unknown. Everything here was deliberate. Nothing was accidental. The earlier identification tag in his pocket suddenly felt heavier, as if its meaning had expanded beyond what he initially understood. Shadow's gaze shifted slightly toward Jason for the first time since they had entered the clearing, a brief moment of connection that carried no uncertainty. It was not a question. It was confirmation. Jason exhaled slowly and returned his attention forward. The clearing was beginning to reveal its full layout now. Several additional shelters were visible at varying distances, each positioned with clear purpose. Between them, faint pathways showed repeated use patterns. The entire arrangement suggested coordination between multiple points rather than isolation. Jason noticed something else then, something that shifted the entire tone of his understanding. Near the far side of the clearing, partially obscured by a line of trees, there was a smaller structure separated from the others. Its placement was deliberate, slightly removed from the central network. And near that structure, a faint reflective surface caught the dim ambient light. Jason narrowed his eyes, focusing carefully. It was not equipment. It was movement. Someone was sitting or resting just beyond the edge of visibility. Shadow's ears angled sharply toward the same direction. Jason felt a pulse of realization building, steady and undeniable. Whatever this place was, it was not simply a network of structures or communications. It was a convergence point for something more personal, something tied directly to the search that had brought them here. Jason shifted forward one careful step, then another, staying within the cover of the trees while maintaining sight of the clearing. The air felt different now, less like wilderness and more like a controlled environment disguised as nature. Every detail reinforced that impression. Even the fog seemed to move in patterns that revealed rather than concealed. A faint sound reached Jason's ears then, barely audible over the ambient silence. It was not mechanical. It was human, controlled, and steady. He paused immediately, focusing entirely on that direction. Shadow remained still, but his attention locked onto the same point without hesitation. Jason slowly reached toward his radio again, then stopped. Communication still felt premature. Something about this moment required observation before action. He lowered his hand and focused entirely on what lay ahead. The figure near the distant structure shifted again, this time more clearly visible through a break in the fog. Jason could now confirm that it was a person, seated or positioned deliberately, not restrained or in distress, but clearly part of the system they had uncovered. The realization was not dramatic. It arrived quietly, like a piece of information finally clicking into place after being held in fragments for too long. Shadow took one final step forward and stopped at the threshold of the clearing, no longer waiting for Jason to interpret anything further. Jason understood immediately. This was the point where observation ended and understanding began. He stepped forward beside Shadow, both of them now fully visible at the edge of the clearing, where the hidden network and the silent forest met, and where everything they had followed was finally about to reveal its true purpose. Jason Miller and Shadow stood at the edge of the clearing, no longer hidden by layers of forest, fully exposed to the quiet geometry of the hidden network. The air felt different here, thinner in its tension, as if every breath carried information rather than just oxygen. Jason kept his posture steady, eyes moving slowly across the open space while registering every detail at once. The arrangement of shelters, the controlled lighting, the structured pathways between points, all of it now formed a single coherent picture rather than scattered fragments. Shadow remained perfectly still beside him, but his focus had shifted slightly toward the central structure where faint movement continued inside and around the dim light. Jason did not step forward yet. Something about the stillness told him that entering without understanding would change everything in ways that could not be reversed. From the far side of the clearing, a figure finally moved into full view. Not rushing, not reacting, but walking with calm intent toward the center of the space. Jason immediately recognized the posture before the face became clear. Military bearing, controlled movement, no visible weapon raised, no immediate hostility, only presence. The figure stopped at a measured distance from the central structure and turned slightly, as if acknowledging something or someone unseen. Jason tightened his focus, scanning for additional movement, but none came. The forest behind them remained still, almost respectful in its silence. Shadow shifted his weight subtly, not in alertness, but in recognition. Jason noticed that reaction and felt the pressure in his chest increase slightly, not from threat, but from the growing realization that Shadow understood something he had not yet fully processed. The figure in the clearing raised a hand in a slow, deliberate motion, not a signal of command, but something closer to acknowledgement. Jason felt his instincts split between protocol and curiosity. Every training impulse told him to report, to assess, to wait for confirmation. But everything in front of him defied standard categorization. This was not an active engagement zone. It was something structured but hidden, functional but concealed. Jason finally took one careful step forward, staying partially within the cover of the trees while maintaining visual contact with both the figure and the central structure. Shadow moved with him instantly, matching his pace without hesitation. The connection between them felt absolute now, not as handler and K9, but as two observers arriving at the same conclusion through different paths. The figure near the center turned slightly again, and Jason now saw more clearly. There was no panic in their posture, no attempt to hide or flee. Instead, there was a stillness that suggested expectation, as if the arrival of Jason and Shadow had been anticipated rather than discovered. Jason's hand hovered near his radio again, but he did not activate it. Something in the atmosphere of the clearing discouraged interruption. Even the wind seemed reduced here, moving only in faint intervals between structures. Shadow took another step forward, then paused at the threshold of the clearing, no longer behind cover. Jason followed, stepping fully into the open space for the first time. The change was immediate. The forest behind them felt distant, almost disconnected, as if they had crossed an invisible boundary separating two different realities. The central structure now revealed more detail under the dim light. Equipment was organized with precision, not abandoned, not improvised, but maintained. Maps and documents were arranged in a way that suggested continuity of purpose rather than emergency reaction. Jason moved forward slowly, eyes locked on the figure who now stood facing them directly. There was recognition in the posture, but not familiarity, more like acknowledgement of arrival. Shadow remained steady at Jason's side, his gaze alternating between the figure and the central structure, as if verifying alignment between perception and reality. Jason finally stopped at a distance where conversation would be possible if initiated. Silence stretched between them, not empty, but dense with implication. The figure did not speak immediately. Instead, they looked at Shadow for a long moment, then back to Jason, as if confirming something internal rather than external. Jason felt the weight of that silence press gently but firmly against everything he had assumed about the mission so far. The forest around them remained unchanged, but the meaning of it had shifted entirely. This was no longer a search through unknown terrain. It was an arrival at something already in motion long before they had entered it. And Shadow, still perfectly still, seemed to understand that truth more clearly than anyone present. The silence in the clearing held for several seconds after Jason Miller and Shadow came to a full stop, as if the entire space was waiting for the first word to define what reality would become next. The figure standing near the central structure did not move closer, nor did they step back. Instead, they remained exactly where they were, maintaining a steady posture that suggested calm awareness rather than uncertainty. Jason kept his stance controlled, feet planted evenly, eyes scanning without rushing, absorbing every detail of the environment before making any assumption about intent. Shadow stood beside him, perfectly aligned, his attention still divided between the figure and the deeper arrangement of structures behind them. The fog drifted slowly through the clearing again, but now it felt different, less like concealment and more like a curtain that had already finished its role. The figure finally spoke, their voice calm and even, carrying across the clearing without effort. Jason did not react outwardly, but internally he registered the tone immediately. It was not defensive, not surprised, and not fearful. It was composed, as if this moment had been anticipated long before arrival. Jason took a single careful step forward, just enough to reduce distance without breaking caution. Shadow followed in perfect sync. The figure's gaze shifted briefly to Shadow again, holding there for a moment longer than necessary, then returned to Jason. There was something in that gaze that Jason could not immediately categorize. Not recognition of identity, but recognition of alignment. As if Shadow had already answered a question Jason had not yet fully formed. Jason's hand hovered near his vest, then relaxed again, choosing observation over reaction. The forest behind them remained still, but the stillness now felt structured rather than natural, as though everything within this space had been arranged to maintain balance until the correct variables arrived. The figure slowly gestured toward the central structure, not commanding, but inviting awareness. Jason's eyes followed the motion. Inside the structure, the organized layout of equipment and materials now appeared more clearly under the dim interior light. Everything was arranged with intentional precision, reinforcing the sense that this was not an abandoned location, but a maintained operational point. Jason began to understand that what he had initially interpreted as concealment was actually continuity. Shadow shifted slightly closer to Jason, not out of tension, but as if reinforcing shared perception. The figure stepped just half a pace to the side, revealing more of the interior behind them. Jason saw additional details that had been obscured before, including communication equipment and layered documentation pinned and secured along a makeshift interior panel. The arrangement suggested coordination, mapping, and tracking over time, not isolated activity. Jason's mind began assembling a larger structure from the fragments he had collected since entering the forest. The identification tag, the survival pouch, the coded coordinates, the concealed shelters, and now this central node of organized information. None of it existed independently. Everything was connected. Shadow let out a low breath through his nose, almost imperceptible, but Jason noticed it immediately. It was not a warning. It was confirmation. Jason turned his attention back to the figure, who now stood with a more neutral posture, neither blocking nor advancing. The distance between them remained unchanged, but the psychological space had shifted significantly. Jason felt it clearly. The unknown was no longer outside their reach. It was directly in front of them, waiting to be acknowledged fully. He spoke for the first time, voice steady but controlled, asking a simple question that carried the weight of everything they had uncovered so far. The figure listened without interruption, then responded with the same measured calm. As the exchange continued, Jason realized that the purpose of this place was not to hide something dangerous in the traditional sense, but to preserve something structured under conditions that required concealment. Shadow remained still throughout the exchange, but his attention never wavered. At one point, the figure briefly lowered their gaze toward him again, and for a moment, there was an almost imperceptible shift in expression. Not surprise, not concern, but acknowledgement of understanding that extended beyond spoken language. Jason noticed it, but did not interrupt it. Instead, he allowed the silence to continue, recognizing that answers here were not being given in single statements, but in layers of awareness unfolding gradually. The forest around them remained unchanged, yet its meaning had completely transformed. It was no longer a barrier or a mystery. It was a boundary that had already been crossed the moment Shadow chose the path forward. And now, standing within the center of what they had followed, Jason understood that nothing they had seen so far was the end of discovery. It was only the beginning of understanding what had been waiting here. All along, Jason Miller stood in the center of the clearing with Shadow beside him. And for the first time since entering the forest, there was no sense of pursuit, only presence. The figure in front of them remained calm, maintaining a steady distance that no longer felt like separation but balance. The surrounding structures, the layered equipment, and the organized network hidden within the trees all felt less like a discovery now and more like a confirmation of something already in motion long before their arrival. Jason's breathing slowed naturally, his body shifting from alert pursuit into controlled awareness, the kind trained into him through years of missions where clarity only came after silence was fully understood. Shadow did not move. His posture remained aligned with Jason, but his attention was no longer searching. It was settled, directed inward toward understanding rather than outward toward threat. The figure finally spoke again, and this time the tone carried something deeper than explanation. It carried context. Jason listened without interruption, his eyes steady, absorbing each word carefully, while simultaneously observing the subtle details. Around them, the central structure behind the figure was now fully visible. Inside, Jason could see layers of documentation, maps connected by lines of coordination, and equipment arranged not for concealment, but for continuity. This was not improvisation. It was sustained structure operating under concealment. As the explanation continued, Jason began to see the pattern that had been forming since the first moment Shadow left the barracks. Every fragment they had encountered was not random. The identification tag, the survival pouch, the coded coordinates, the hidden shelters, and the coordinated clearing all pointed toward one integrated system. Jason glanced briefly at Shadow, and in that moment, he realized something that shifted his entire understanding of the mission. Shadow had not been reacting to confusion. He had been responding to familiarity. Not familiarity with place, but familiarity with pattern. The figure paused, allowing silence to settle again across the clearing. Jason used that silence to observe more carefully. Around the perimeter, the forest itself seemed unchanged, yet its role within this space was different now. It was no longer concealment alone. It was protection, a boundary that had allowed something structured to exist without interruption. Jason slowly lowered his hand from his vest, no longer considering communication through radio. There was no need for external confirmation. Everything necessary was already present in front of him. The figure turned slightly, gesturing toward Shadow now rather than Jason. The gesture was not directive. It was acknowledgement. Jason felt Shadow shift subtly beside him, not in response to command, but in recognition of being seen. For the first time, Jason understood that Shadow's behavior throughout the entire journey had not been instinct alone. It had been continuity of memory and connection extending beyond standard operational training. The forest, the structures, the network, and the presence they had encountered were all connected through that same continuity. Jason finally spoke again, his voice steady but no longer uncertain. The response from the figure was calm, almost expected, as if this question had been part of the sequence from the beginning. As they spoke, the tension that had followed Jason since the moment Shadow left the barracks began to dissolve, replaced not by resolution, but by clarity. There was no enemy revealed, no immediate threat exposed, but something far more complex had emerged. A hidden system of coordination existing parallel to official structure, sustained through discipline and secrecy. Jason looked again at the central arrangement, then back toward Shadow. The dog remained composed, his gaze steady, his presence grounded in something deeper than reaction. Jason realized then that Shadow had not brought him here by chance. He had brought him here by recognition, not of danger, but of truth that needed to be seen rather than hidden. The figure stepped slightly back toward the central structure, leaving Jason and Shadow standing together at the center of the clearing. The forest around them remained silent, but no longer mysterious. It had become witness rather than concealment. Jason exhaled slowly, allowing the full weight of understanding to settle without resistance. What they had followed was never meant to be a pursuit of unknown danger. It was a return to something already in motion, something structured, preserved, and waiting for acknowledgement. Shadow remained beside him, steady and unwavering, as the clearing held its silence, and the truth of everything they had uncovered finally reached its full shape in the quiet space between certainty and understanding.